What's going on, you guys? It's Jay. And have you guys ever thought about playing a game and then realize how complicated it is, so you just kind of give up on playing it entirely? Either because you're too stupid or too lazy like me. Well, that's exactly how I feel about Path of Exile. Everyone always tells me how amazing it is, how it's the best ARPG ever, and how I need to play it. I'm not some insane min-max ARPG player, but I do like playing them. I played Diablo 4 at launch, and I enjoyed it up until Season 1, and then I uninstalled like everyone else after that. I'm also a big Grim Dawn fan, but I've always been really interested in Path of Exile. I tried to play it a few times with a build guide because everyone says how you need to play it with a guide, but whenever I used one, it never really felt like I was actually playing the game. I will say I did enjoy the gameplay, but every time I'd open up the insane skill tree, my brain would have an aneurysm, filling in the bubbles with my guide like I'm cheating on the SAT, so I never made it past the second act in the story. I've still always wanted to really get into Path of Exile though. It's been a couple of years since my last attempt, and recently I heard the new Season of Affliction really slaps, so I said, you know what better way to try and force myself to sit down and learn PoE than doing a video on it. Before we dive on in though, let me explain the plan I made. My one and only rule was that I couldn't use a build guide. No matter how utterly fucked my build was, I was gonna learn as many mechanics as I possibly could on my own. I read online that you can complete the campaign with whatever build you wanted, so I wasn't that scared. I knew I wasn't gonna be able to compete in the end game, but I figured after playing through the game with my own build, it'd be way easier to understand and use a build guide after that. Like once I got the feel of the game's mechanics and everything. If you want a quick rundown though, I died a lot using my own build. I'll dive deeper in a second, but yeah, I struggled. However, not as bad as I thought. I had a really good time actually, and I finally get the hype around PoE because it's a good game and a really good ARPG. I still don't know like 75% of the game's mechanics, and if anything, I'm lowballing that number. It's probably more like 90%. Path of Exile is probably one of the only games where you'll have people with thousands of hours of game time and they still have no idea what they're doing. Imagine Diablo 4 is like addition and subtraction in elementary school, while PoE is like college calculus. With all that being said though, let's dive into this absolute monster of a game, starting with my own build. Alright, let's start with the class I chose. I went witch because I like magic and I figured it would be easier to create a build, even though I had no idea what I was going to base my build around. But luckily when you start the game, PoE does a decent job at explaining the really basic mechanics. Like put gem in slot, gem gives you ability. And obviously fireball is pretty easy to understand, and the first few skill tree points aren't too difficult to figure out. Right off the bat though, I want to say that I really enjoy Path of Exile's atmosphere and art style. I know they've done some graphical updates throughout the years, and I think this game genuinely looks great. And the story is decent enough and not too overly involved, which I appreciate, because let's be honest, if you're playing ARPGs, you're not playing for the story. You're only playing to obliterate waves and waves of enemies. PoE really does nail the satisfying feeling of mindlessly killing mobs over and over. Each map flows really well, and you aren't tasked with annoying game flow disrupting mechanics like Diablo 4. This is the reason why I like ARPGs though, just chilling, clicking buttons and deleting mobs. Not running around trying to find some stupid fucking keys or trying to find the 7 people in the dungeon that I need to save. The gameplay here in PoE is top notch and really well designed. You can really tell that grinding tier games knows what they're doing. Anyway, the first couple of zones were fine for the most part. I was clearing enemies, completing all my quests. Very quickly I was given other gems as quest rewards, and this got me to sit and think for a while on what each gem did and what I wanted to use. At this point I kind of just winged it and thought I should stick with one element, so I chose all the electric gems. I was swapping them in and out, trying to find what worked and what felt good. Half of the abilities though I was using incorrectly at first, especially Orb of Storms. I just kind of placed it and that was it. I was very unimpressed, but once I finally used Orb of Storms correctly, it was like my third eye opening. I immediately wanted to base my build around it. It was perfect against the waves and waves of enemies due to the chain effect, so I kept building into it, reading the skill tree, trying to find out what I wanted to spec into. I swear to God, I just sat and looked at the skill tree for hours just trying to read it. It was fun though. I felt like I was beginning to learn and understand, well, as much as I can with my low IQ and low playtime. I got some decent enough support gems linked into Orb of Storm, so I was feeling pretty good. After a while, I was beginning to debuff enemies and trigger a guaranteed shock effect with Lightning Conduit, and I felt like I was doing some good damage. All up until around Act 6 or 7, I very quickly began to realize I had zero sustainability or defense. I would get melted. Usually I was fine against regular mobs as long as I didn't get caught, but bosses would absolutely obliterate me. The amount of times I died during this playthrough was insane. I tried my best to spec into more health and defense, but it just wasn't enough. I don't think I was speccing into the right defense trees because nothing was really working for me. Looking back now and after looking at some other builds, I feel like I should have used Aura Restoring specifically for packs and then maybe having an ability specifically for bosses. I think that would have maybe have helped with my damage because I was still able to kill most packs, but my damage against bosses just wasn't that great. I mean, it was alright, but I feel like it could have been way better. Definitely had like 0 chance in the end game, but I accomplished what I set out to do. Still though, I feel like it was worth trying to play through the game blind. It got me really invested and I've been really enjoying playing through again with an actual build guide. I'm following this crazy freezing pulse totem build and I'm excited to see how it plays out. I'm really hoping to be able to try out the end game grind with this build. I can't say much about the end game because I couldn't even clear out my first map, but I've heard really great things. I know it's insanely massive and really complex, but I feel like the end game is the real game and the story is just the tutorial, just due to the fact of how massive PoE's end game is. But the rest of the game is really good, from the mechanics to the enemies and the bosses. All the bosses are sick and feel climactic with the story and have fairly designed mechanics that have you dodging AoEs. Like I said earlier, most of the bosses would absolutely obliterate me most of the time, but sometimes I would survive long enough to feel cool because I would dodge a mechanic or two. I found every act in the story really entertaining, and I really like the variation of each zone. It keeps the game feeling fresh, especially with the amount of enemy variety that's in the game. There wasn't any point where I felt bored with the enemies I was fighting, and the mob density is perfect. There's just an endless amount of mobs for you to kill as you run through each zone, and it feels really good. Another aspect I think that's worth mentioning is I'm trying to speedrun the story with my second character, and it's surprisingly easy to just fly through the story, which I think overall is a really good thing, especially for the die-hard PoE chads who make like 5 characters a season. But Path of Exile's main strength is definitely the gameplay. It's just something really special, and I really meant it when I said earlier that grinding geared games knows what they're doing when it comes to an ARPG. There's just so much to Path of Exile. I've barely scratched the surface. I didn't touch the crafting at all, but I know stuff like that is really insanely in depth. I messed around with the new seasonal activity and used the seasonal skill tree that you unlocked. It was really cool. I'd be lying if I said I knew how most of it worked, but it was still worth checking out. I would imagine that you reap the seasonal benefits later in the endgame. There's also the Ascendancy trials, which I was actually able to get a grasp on, unlike the other past seasonal content that was added into the base game, like delves. I didn't really mess around much with these activities because I figured they were mostly for endgame, but when I did mess around with them, it was always fun. I really struggled with my first delve activity, but I think that was on purpose. I will say it can be a little overwhelming at times with the amount of content there actually is in PoE, but I've definitely seen worse, and it's easy to brush aside while you just focus on completing the campaign. With that being said though, I actually love how much depth there is to PoE, and while I barely know anything about the game and its deep mechanics, it's still a fun ARPG that you can play through at your own pace. It might take more than a couple thousand hours to start feeling confident with your PoE wizard wisdom, but it makes sense why so many people love this game. It feels like there's infinite replayability on top of the vast amount of endgame content, and once you start getting into this game, it's like crack, dude. I literally couldn't stop playing, and after this video, I'm gonna go right back to grinding my totem build. I really wish I was able to try and grind some legendary items so I can talk a little bit about the loot, but what I can say about the loot is holy shit. I played without an item filter for like 10 hours, and it got so wacky. Don't get me wrong, it's so satisfying having all these loot pinatas, but goddamn, you're gonna need an item filter. Good thing is though, it's super easy to get one going, and it really improved my overall experience. But before that, I was just picking up the most useless random shit. Another thing I want to talk about is Path of Exile's free-to-play model, because I gotta praise the game for not shoving microtransactions down my throat like most free-to-play games do. The microtransactions are expensive, but it doesn't really affect the gameplay at all in any way. Well, I do know that if you buy stash tabs, it really does improve the quality of life in the game, especially in the end game. But you know, if I'm putting hundreds of hours into a free-to-play game, I don't mind spending like $40 to $60 to improve my experience. It's also really cool that most of your microtransactions will carry over to PoE 2 when it drops. But I don't know, man, I feel like PoE is free-to-play done right. And I was gonna try and keep myself from dotting on Diablo 4 too much in this video, but holy fuck, man. I'd much rather be spending money getting stash tabs in PoE than spending $65 for a horse skin and a $70 premium title. That's all I'm gonna say about Diablo 4 because everything's been said already. But PoE slaps though, you guys. I get why everyone loves this game, but what I don't get is most of the game's mechanics, but I'll get there eventually, you know? I'm definitely gonna be creating a new character every season, and there's still so much PoE left for me to explore. So many builds, so many activities, and a whole end game I haven't even touched yet. I'm gonna be eating good until PoE 2 drops, which, speaking of PoE 2, it's looking just as promising, and from what I'm hearing, it'll be way easier for new players to get into it. But overall though, I loved my time with PoE, and I'm really excited to keep grinding the game. I'm mad at myself for not getting into it earlier, but it is what it is. Anyways though, you you guys, I feel like it's a great place to call the video. Hopefully you enjoyed, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.